When a well-dressed man entered a prestigious bank to cash a check, he anticipated professionalism. Instead, he was met with humiliation. What the bank manager didn't realize, however, was that this man wasn't just any customer. He was the owner of the bank. What followed left the entire room in stunned silence. The bell above the door chimed softly as Darius stepped into the opulent interior of Crownstone Bank in downtown Nashville. The air carried a faint scent of leather and polished wood, blending seamlessly with the quiet murmur of transactions echoing off the high marble ceilings. Dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit, Darius exuded quiet confidence as he approached the teller line, a large check in hand. His expression was calm, nearly unreadable. The line moved slowly, but he appeared unbothered, his dark eyes scanning the room with measured patience. The chandeliers overhead cast a warm glow on the customers seated in plush chairs, adding to the ambience of wealth and exclusivity. This was the kind of place where prestige clung to every surface, a space that presumed its patrons had earned the right to be there. When his turn arrived, Darius stepped forward and handed the check to the young teller behind the counter. She glanced at it, her eyebrows lifting slightly at the amount before her face quickly returned to a neutral mask. "I'll need to call my manager to approve this, sir," she said, her tone polite but tinged with hesitation. Darius nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Of course. Take your time." Moments later, a man in his mid-50s appeared, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed and his expensive suit radiating authority. Mr. Simmons, the bank manager, approached the counter briskly, his eyes zeroing in on the check. He took it from the teller, his gaze flickering to Darius with the briefest hesitation. There was a pause, a subtle narrowing of Simmons's eyes. "Excuse me, sir," he began, his voice low but firm. "Do you have any ID to accompany this check?" Without missing a beat, Darius reached into his pocket and slid his driver's license across the counter. Simmons barely glanced at it before handing it back, his expression tight. "I see. Well, I'll need to verify this with the issuing party," Simmons said, holding the check as if it were a suspicious artifact. Something in the atmosphere shifted, a subtle but unmistakable charge that Darius didn't miss. Simmons's skepticism wasn't procedural. It was personal. "Is there an issue?" Darius asked, his tone measured but firm. Simmons didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the check, the corners of his mouth tugging downward. "Just give me a moment," he muttered before walking briskly toward his office. The tension in the room thickened as Darius waited. He stood tall, his posture straight, his expression composed. Around him, the bank bustled with activity, but a faint murmur of whispers began to rise. A few customers stole curious glances in his direction. When Simmons returned minutes later, the check still in his hand, his expression was stern, almost unreadable. "I've looked into this, Mr. Darius, is it?" Simmons said, deliberately omitting his last name as if it didn't matter. "This check raises some red flags. Can you tell me where you got it?" Darius tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Simmons's. "It was issued to me as payment for a business transaction. Everything is in order, I assure you." Simmons's lips pressed into a thin line. "A business transaction, you say?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping but retaining its edge. "And what business are you in?" For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around them. "I'm in real estate development," Darius replied evenly. Simmons let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Real estate, huh? Must be quite the deal to warrant a check like this." He waved the paper slightly, his tone sharpening. "Look, these things don't just fall out of the sky. I'm going to have to decline this transaction." The words hung in the air like a slap. "You haven't verified anything yet," Darius said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "The issuing party's contact information is right there. Call them." Simmons dismissed him with a wave. "I don't need to waste my time chasing down details for something that's obviously suspicious. If you'd like, you can try cashing this somewhere else." His voice had risen slightly, drawing more attention from staff and customers. A woman seated near the entrance glanced up, her eyes darting between Simmons and Darius. A pair of tellers exchanged whispers, their nervous gazes flicking toward the manager. Darius stepped closer to the counter, his calm exterior now threaded with quiet intensity. So, you're refusing to validate this check because of why, exactly? Simmons shrugged, his tone condescending. These procedures are in place for a reason. It's not personal. But the way his eyes lingered on Darius said otherwise. If it's not personal, Darius said, his voice razor-sharp, then why not follow standard protocol and verify it? Or are you suggesting I don't belong here? The question landed hard, and for a moment, Simmons faltered. But he quickly recovered, a smirk tugging at his lips. Sir, this bank reserves the right to refuse service if something seems off. And frankly, this doesn't look right to me. The murmur in the room grew louder, the tension palpable. Darius glanced around briefly, noting the uncomfortable expressions on the other patrons' faces. Yet, none of them spoke up. Interesting, Darius said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. He straightened his jacket with deliberate precision. So, you're declining to provide service based on feelings rather than facts. Simmons's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. Sir, I don't have to explain myself further. You can take this matter up with another branch if you like. Darius stood still for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached for the check still in Simmons's hand. If that's your final decision, I'll handle this another way, he said evenly, his tone carrying a weight that made Simmons falter slightly. As Darius turned and pulled out his phone, Simmons muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. Some people really don't know when to quit. The quiet resolve on Darius's face betrayed nothing, but the sharp glint in his eyes made one thing clear. This wasn't over. He stepped aside to a quieter corner of the bank, his phone held loosely in one hand. Taking a deep breath, he calmed himself, though the slight tightening of his jaw revealed his simmering frustration. He began dialing a number, his voice low and measured as he spoke. Those close enough to overhear caught fragments of the conversation. Yes, at the branch now. Refusing to process? I understand. Meanwhile, Simmons watched him from the counter, a faintly smug grin tugging at his lips. Leaning casually against the polished wood, he addressed the curious stares of nearby customers. We have to be vigilant with fraud these days, he said, his voice carrying an air of self-importance. It's unfortunate, but not everyone comes in here with honest intentions. A woman standing in line shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting toward Darius. A man seated near the entrance frowned, but remained silent. Simmons, feeding off the unease in the room, straightened his posture, emboldened by the quiet approval of those around him. Moments later, Darius ended his call and returned to the counter, his composure unshaken. I've taken the necessary steps to address this, he said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension. I'd advise you to wait before making further assumptions, but Simmons wasn't interested in listening. He leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. Sir, you're free to address it however you like, but this check isn't going anywhere. I have a duty to protect this institution from potential scams. Darius's eyes narrowed slightly. Potential scams based on what? My appearance? My profession? Though his voice remained quiet, it carried a sharp edge that sliced through the air. Simmons's smug demeanor faltered, if only for a second, before he quickly recovered. I don't know what you're implying, sir, Simmons said loudly, clearly performing for the growing audience. I'm simply following standard procedures. Darius gave a small, humorless laugh. Your standard procedures don't seem to involve verifying facts. Instead, they involve making baseless assumptions in front of an audience. A hushed silence fell over the room. Customers and staff alike strained to catch every word. Simmons, now visibly irritated, straightened his jacket and waved dismissively. Look, I've made my decision. If you'd like to escalate the matter, you're welcome to. But you're wasting your time here. For the first time, a flicker of something sharper passed over Darius's composed exterior. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. Oh, I'll escalate it, Mr. Simmons. And trust me, you're going to regret this, Simmons scoffed, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. Is that a threat? He asked, though his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier. Darius didn't respond. Instead, he turned and pulled out his phone again, dialing with deliberate precision. His movements remained calm, despite the humiliation Simmons had attempted to inflict. "Some people think they can just walk in here and demand anything they want," Simmons muttered, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. A few chuckled nervously, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to react. The tension in the room grew suffocating, the air thick with unspoken judgments. And yet, Darius stood as a pillar of quiet resolve, his calm contrasting starkly with the chaos around him. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps broke the uneasy silence. A group of sharply dressed individuals entered the bank, their presence commanding immediate attention. The leader, a tall woman in a tailored blazer, exuded authority as her sharp eyes scanned the room. They landed on Darius, and her expression softened into a respectful smile. "Mr. Charles," she said warmly, her tone professional and poised. "I came as soon as I got your call." The room plunged into stunned silence. Simmons's face paled, his confident posture crumbling as the realization of who Darius had just summoned began to dawn. In an instant, the balance of power shifted, leaving everyone breathless with anticipation. The woman strode confidently across the marble floor, her heels clicking with authority. Behind her, two other executives followed, their tailored suits and stern expressions leaving no doubt that this was not a casual visit. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the group approached Darius. He extended a hand in greeting. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Darius said, his voice calm yet commanding. "Of course," the woman replied, shaking his hand firmly. Then, her expression hardened as she turned toward Simmons. "I assume you're Mr. Simmons, the manager of this branch?" Simmons stumbled over his words. Yes, that's me. May I ask what this is about?" His attempt at maintaining authority fell flat under the weight of the woman's piercing gaze. "This," she said, holding up the check Darius had handed over earlier, "is a matter of grave concern. Mr. Charles here is one of our most valued partners. When he informed us of the treatment he received at your hands, I was appalled." Simmons's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "The valued partner?" he echoed weakly, his face draining of color. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Not just a partner. Mr. Charles is the majority shareholder in this institution." Gasps rippled through the lobby. A man seated near the window dropped the magazine he was holding, his eyes darting between Darius and Simmons. The teller who had initially assisted Darius covered her mouth with her hand, clearly stunned. Darius stood silently, his presence commanding yet understated, as Simmons's fragile composure crumbled under the weight of the revelation. Darius didn't gloat, nor did he raise his voice. Instead, he let the silence speak louder than any words could. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. "Wait, there must be some mistake," Simmons stammered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." "You didn't know," Darius interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled, "because you didn't bother to find out." Simmons's mouth closed as the words hit him like a hammer. "You made a snap judgment about me the moment I walked in here," Darius continued, his voice unwavering. "Instead of verifying the facts, you chose to humiliate me publicly. And that speaks volumes, not just about your professionalism, but about your character." The executive woman turned to Simmons, her expression icy. "Your behavior today was not just unprofessional, it was unacceptable. This institution prides itself on integrity and respect for all clients, regardless of how they look, where they come from, or whatever assumptions you might make about them." I can explain," Simmons stuttered, his face now slick with sweat. Darius raised a hand, silencing him. "There's no need to explain. Your actions spoke louder than any words ever could. You judged me before you knew anything about me, and you made it very clear to everyone here what you truly believe." The room was dead silent. Every eye was on Simmons, who now looked as though he wished the ground would swallow him whole. Then Darius turned, addressing the gathered customers and staff. His voice carried the weight of both disappointment and hope. "I want to be very clear," Darius began, stepping forward, his calm demeanor now underscored by unmistakable authority. "This isn't just about me. This is about the way people are treated when assumptions replace facts, when bias overrides professionalism. He gestured to the check, still clutched in Simmons's trembling hand. I walked in here today expecting to be treated like any other client, fairly, respectfully, and with the courtesy that any paying customer deserves. Instead, I was judged on sight, dismissed, and publicly humiliated. The room buzzed with murmurs as Darius's words sank in. A young woman seated near the entrance nodded slightly, her expression one of quiet agreement. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of shock, guilt, and introspection. The executive woman stepped forward again, her sharp heels clicking against the marble. "Mr. Charles, we deeply regret what happened here today," she said, her voice firm but contrite. "I assure you that this does not reflect the values of our institution. We will be taking immediate action to address this incident." Her gaze shifted to Simmons, who now looked like he might faint. "Mr. Simmons," she said, her tone hardening, "your behavior today was not only unprofessional but a clear violation of our code of conduct. You failed to perform even the most basic due diligence before jumping to conclusions. This kind of treatment will not be tolerated." Simmons opened his mouth to protest, but the woman cut him off with a single, sharp gesture. "Save it. Your actions today have already been documented, and we will address them internally. For now, I suggest you step aside while we resolve this matter with Mr. Charles." The audience in the lobby watched in stunned silence as Simmons, pale and visibly shaken, stepped back from the counter. He glanced at Darius, his expression a mix of anger and humiliation, but he said nothing. The woman turned back to Darius, her tone softening. "Mr. Charles, we apologize. If there's anything we can do to rectify this situation immediately, please let us know." Darius looked around the room, his gaze lingering briefly on each face. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but weighted with meaning. "This isn't about rectifying anything for me," he said. "This is about making sure no one else has to go through this. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place in a professional setting, or anywhere else for that matter." His words seemed to strike a chord. Some customers nodded in agreement, while others looked down, avoiding his gaze. Behind the counter, the staff shifted uncomfortably, clearly affected by the confrontation. The executive woman nodded, her expression resolute. "You have our word that we will be taking immediate steps to address these issues, both in this branch and throughout the company. Training, oversight, and accountability will be implemented without delay." Darius offered a small, thoughtful smile. "That's a start," he said. "But remember, change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes from people choosing to do better, every single day." His words hung in the air, leaving everyone in the room with something to think about. But Darius wasn't finished. He turned to Simmons one last time, his gaze steady, not with malice, but with purpose. "Respect," Darius said, his voice quiet yet powerful, "isn't something you give based on assumptions or appearances. It's something you owe to every single person who walks through these doors, whether they're cashing a check for $10 or 10 million. Your job isn't to judge. It's to serve." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with reflection. Simmons stood frozen, his face a mask of regret and shame. Without another word, Darius turned and walked toward the door, the quiet click of his shoes on the marble floor echoing in the stillness. Behind him, the weight of his words lingered, challenging everyone in the room to do better. Simmons's face flushed, his usual air of superiority now reduced to a shadow of what it had been. He tried to hold Darius's gaze but faltered, his eyes dropping to the check still clutched in his trembling hands. Darius's voice was unwavering as he spoke. "I didn't call your regional director here to embarrass you. I could have, but that's not who I am. I called her here to make a point, not just to you, but to everyone in this room. Assumptions like the ones you made today are the foundation of prejudice. They ripple outward, creating barriers that should never exist." The executive woman nodded, her stern gaze fixed on Simmons. "And let me add this, Mr. Simmons," she said coldly. "You didn't just fail to do your job today. You put our institution's reputation on the line. This isn't just a one-off mistake. It's a sign of deeper issues we will be addressing thoroughly." Murmurs rippled through the room as customers exchanged glances, the gravity of the situation settling in. Darius let the silence linger, his presence commanding the room. He took a single step back and spoke with quiet authority. "Respect isn't a favor," he said, his voice clear and resonant. "It's a basic expectation. If you can't meet that standard, then you don't belong in a role of leadership, or in any role that interacts with people." Simmons looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking. But Darius's expression wasn't one of anger. It was one of resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making a lasting change. Turning to the executives, Darius added, "I trust you'll handle this situation appropriately. My concerns have been made clear." "Absolutely, Mr. Charles," the executive woman replied firmly. "This matter is now in our hands." Darius nodded, his composure unbroken. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of several customers, some of whom looked at him with newfound respect, while others appeared ashamed of their earlier judgments. Then, in a final, poignant gesture, Darius reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He handed it to the young teller who had initially served him. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted it. "If you ever feel like you're being treated unfairly, no matter where you are, call me," he said softly. "We all deserve better than what we've seen today." The teller nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Darius adjusted his jacket, casting one last look at Simmons. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed across the marble floor, a sound that carried the weight of justice, dignity, and the promise of change. As the doors closed behind him, the room remained still, everyone left to grapple with what they had witnessed. But one thing was certain, their assumptions would never be the same again. The silence in the bank lingered long after Darius had gone, an unspoken tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Simmons stood frozen behind the counter, his face pale and clammy. He fumbled to set the check down, his hands trembling as he realized the magnitude of what had just unfolded. The executive woman turned to address the room, her voice firm but composed. "Let this be a lesson for everyone here today," she began. "Our institution was built on trust, equality, and fairness. If we fail to uphold those principles, we fail the very people we are here to serve. This isn't just about a single incident. It's about holding ourselves accountable and striving to do better." Several customers nodded, visibly moved. The teller wiped at her eyes discreetly, clearly affected by Darius's parting words. As the executives exited the branch, the room stirred with quiet murmurs. An older gentleman in a tweed jacket leaned toward the woman next to him. "He didn't just teach Simmons a lesson," he said softly. "He taught all of us something today." Outside the bank, Darius stood on the busy Nashville sidewalk, the city's hum of life swirling around him. He glanced up at the building for a brief moment, a faint smile playing on his lips. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a text from the executive woman. "All actions have been set in motion. Thank you for your patience and for giving us the opportunity to right this wrong." Darius typed a brief reply. "Thank you for listening. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step matters." As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, Darius exhaled deeply. The encounter had been draining, but it had also been necessary. For far too long, moments like this had gone unchecked, hidden behind the veil of policies and procedures. But today, he had peeled back that veil for everyone to see. Walking down the street, Darius thought back to the young teller's face, her nervous hands clutching the business card he had given her. If even one person in that room walked away from today with a new perspective, it would have been worth it. The lesson was clear. We must challenge our biases, treat others with dignity, and hold ourselves accountable for how we interact with the world. Every action, no matter how small, has the power to create ripples of change. As Darius disappeared into the bustling city, the faint sound of justice lingered in the air, leaving behind a story that no one in that bank would soon forget. Stories like these remind us of the importance of challenging prejudice and standing up for fairness. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it, subscribing to our channel, and joining us in promoting the values of respect, equality, and understanding. Together, we can create a ripple effect of positive change.